Hi, welcome to How to Choose a Probiotic Part 1. I'm Dr. Jax Cooper, and I'm here today to talk to you about the three most important criteria as practitioners to be thinking about when we're selecting a probiotic. Now, I will self-admit, in my early career, choosing a probiotic was somewhat arbitrary. I had been prescribed HMF probiotics when I was a student at CCNM. I had, great results personally, and that largely drove me to continue leveraging HMF probiotics with my patients as a practitioner. That being said, I didn't appreciate or really understand why they worked so well until I came to start teaching for Genestra. I had, experienced great results, and I wanted to share those experiences and my passion for the products with other practitioners. And so today is really about, getting a chance to share with you how much I've learned in being immersed about the microbiome and with close proximity to leading experts like Dr. Nigel Plummer so that all of us can feel really good about our choices. As far as speaker disclosures go, I am an employee of Atrium, but I have no other conflicts of interest to disclose. And that all being said, everything I talk to you about today is my own personal and professional opinion. Last disclosure and disclaimer, we want to just ensure that it is well understood. This information is for healthcare practitioners and providers. This is not intended for a general public audience. When we start to consider supplements in general, I think there's two things that I really like to hammer home. One is that supplements are indeed supplements. They are meant to be supplemental to a healthy lifestyle. As much as we're looking for quick fixes so often in life, there's no amount of supplementation that can make up for an unhealthy diet and lifestyle. So we really always want to be emphasizing the importance of living healthy, breathing, stress management, diet, hydration, sleep, movement, alongside a really strategic supplemental regimen. Now, when we turn, towards deciding what those supplements are, I think it's always so important that we make sure we start with, key foundational elements that are important, like a probiotic. And I see a probiotic to me as being absolutely paramount as a foundational element of health. And, frankly, I would put it right in there as part of a healthy lifestyle because research has now shown that, probiotic supplementation is hugely important and necessary to maintain a healthy microbiome, and that there's no amount of healthy food choices that can replenish a depleted microbiome. So while food choices are important, particularly fiber, at helping nurture the gut microbiome, and we'll talk about that as we go along, when the microbiome is depleted, it does actually need supplementation with the live organisms. And so that's where probiotics really come as a core foundational factor. And this adage, all disease begins in the gut, has persisted for millennia because there is so much truth to it. So if we can hone our microbiome, there is a lot of really powerful ripple effects that we'll see throughout the rest of the organ systems. Okay, we're going to start by looking at the physiology of our microbiome. So we're going to look at some stats around the human microbiome, as well as then taking a look at the difference in function and physiology of the small versus large intestine and what that means for the gut bacteria. And that'll lead us right into colonization patterns that are really important to understand before we select a probiotic. So one of the questions I get all the time is how long do I need to take a probiotic for? And that's a great question. And one of the answers I give, if someone's taking a probiotic to help address a certain subset of symptoms, I would say take that probiotic until those symptoms go away and you're satisfied with the state of your health. And then, as with pretty much, I would say, any supplemental strategy, you don't want to go off cold turkey, but half the dose. And half the dose in do that for a couple of weeks and see if your body is able to maintain, that state of absence of symptoms. If it is, you could even half the dose from there. And typically I explain to people to wean off the supplements they were taking. That being said, I mentioned on the slide previous that probiotics are a really foundational element of health, and I personally believe should be part of just healthy living. The reason for that is, as you can see on this slide, there are so many things, factors, stress levels, foods, medications, environmental toxins in particular, being something that is difficult for us to control, and they wreak havoc on our microbiome. So we so commonly see depleted microbiomes because of the cluster of these factors. So while we can absolutely, take in lots of beneficial foods, fermented foods, fibrous foods, omega-3s, particularly because of their effect on our mucosal membrane and epithelial linings. So in order to, have great colonization of microflora, beneficial microflora, we need a healthy, lining. So omega-3s and probiotics really go hand in hand. So again, we can be doing a lot of these things well, but we are always going to be encountering some level of toxicity via the air, via our water. Again, stress, all of these factors, really can take a toll. So I am often explaining to people, if we want to be proactive and truly practicing preventative health, a probiotic is part of our ongoing daily regimen. Before we choose a probiotic to recommend to our patient or client, it's really important that we think about what area of the digestive tract are we trying to focus and colonize, and to think about, really the differences physiologically between the small intestine and the large. So first and foremost is just looking at the difference in length and the transit time. So our small intestine being 20 feet long, it takes about 2 to 4 hours for food to get through the entire small intestine. Conversely, looking at the large intestine, only 4 feet long, but has an incredibly slow transit time of 18 to 90 hours. So what does this mean in relation to the bacteria and in recommending a probiotic? Well, because of the fast transit time, the bacteria that resides in the small intestine, especially the upper region of the small intestine right after the stomach, the duodenum, where we see the majority of our immune, our gut brain, and hormonal function being influenced by the bacteria, that the bacteria has to be attached to the cell lining in order to colonize that region, because the fast transit time would sweep that bacteria away if it is not latched onto the epithelial lining at the attachment sites. So what we see is, in general, it is a very low concentrated area. So very small numbers, 2 to 25 billion needed of CFU, of a count of probiotics, in order to effectively colonize the small intestine. And this is where we are most often targeting because of it being the hot zone for majority of the immune, endocrine, and enteric neural functioning. It's also the most significant site of disruption from antibiotics. So we know Canadians in particular tend to, on average, experience a course of antibiotics every year to 2 years. So this is the area that is most heavily depleted and in need of restoration. So again, that's the small intestine, and that's where we're looking in that 2 to 25 billion range of probiotics, and where we're most often focusing. With the large intestine, because of this slow transit time, the density of bacteria is much, much more concentrated. And so if we're trying to shift what's happening there, this is where we're going to use big, big numbers. So we're looking to 100 billion to 2,000 billion colony forming units to shift what's going on here. The thing is, this is very, I would say, less often the focus with probiotics, and more often the focus with prebiotics. So looking at those fibrous foods and fermentation to shift what's happening in the large intestine typically. So we already mentioned the pattern of increasing density that you can see outlined here. So the deeper we go through the intestinal system, the more and more concentrated the numbers. And again, that's due to the transit time. The other pattern, however, we see is that the type of bacteria changes. So as we go deeper through the digestive system, we see increased numbers and diversity, as well as a change in the dominant type. So that has to do predominantly with the oxygen levels. So in the upper regions, there's more oxygen present, and so we see the lactobacilli as being the more dominant type of bacteria. But as that oxygen starts to deplete, we see the bifidobacteria take over as the more dominant species. So now both bifido and lactobacilli are able to live in both oxygen-rich and oxygen-depleted environments, but the lactobacilli do prefer that oxygen-rich environment, whereas the bifidobacteria prefer the anaerobic, so the lack of oxygen, and hence we see the shift in patterns of dominance. The love for oxygen is also what makes the lactobacilli such the dominant genus and type of species found in the vaginal canal, because again, oxygen rich. So that factor has a big part into play of, again, depending on what part of the digestive tract are we addressing, is going to really focus us in on what type of bacteria we're looking for. And again, vast majority of the time, we're looking to colonize the upper regions of the small intestine, the duodenum, because that first foot and a half after the stomach is really the hot zone where the crux of the gut-brain activity, the immune functionality, and even the endocrine effects, the kind of system-wide effects we see, are typically concentrated in that upper region of the small intestine. Okay, so now let's look at what are the critical criteria for choosing a probiotic, and also, really important, at what point do we decide it's best to incorporate prebiotics? There are three critical steps in choosing an effective probiotic. One is it human strain? Two, is it backed by clinical research? Ideally human clinical research. And then finally, three, we look at the CFU count and delivery method. Unfortunately, a mistake I see being made all the time by both consumers and practitioners alike is often they are starting here at step number 3 and choosing the probiotic based on the CFU count. So they start off by saying, I want a 25 billion CFU, or I want a 50 billion CFU, thinking that the number on the package is what tells them the value they're getting, or the amount they're getting, or the intended effect that they're getting, and that more is better, because so often that can be the case. However, when it comes to bacteria, the first thing we need to be looking at to determine the value and the effect and potential outcome is it human strain? Because species specific bacteria has been inextricably shown to really determine the ability of that bacteria to attach. So it's like a lock and key, and there's a species specific affinity. So, we look at the birth of probiotics, the whole industry stemmed from agriculture. And this explains why we see so much dairy-based probiotic strains on the market being marketed to humans, because they were initially developed to help with, promoting the health of cows and, other farm animals that were being kept in close proximity. And how do we improve, the health of these animals? And what they found was that when you took cow bacteria and gave it to cows, it was much more effective than taking that cow bacteria and giving it to pigs and vice versa. So with these crossover studies, they found, bacteria from healthy animals, really dramatically helped to improve the health of animals when it was same species. They did show, again, marginal significant improvements of health cross species wise, much like we see there are many dairy strains that can improve human health, but they do not compare to human strains in the improvement of human health. And that has a lot to do with the attachment affinity. And so again, this is seen throughout the research. The most dramatic, research results come from species specific. I think the classic one is also thinking about the obese mouse. So looking at normal weighted and obese mice and doing the transplants of microflora from one to the other and seeing the weight shift regardless of diet when taking the healthy microflora and putting it into the obese mouse and seeing that obese mouse lose weight, and vice versa, taking the unhealthy flora from the obese mouse into the healthy weighted mouse and seeing it consequentially gain weight without changes in diet. So, these are some of the dramatic studies that have really kind of blown the doors open and channeled scientists' focus on the power of the microbiome. And always the most dramatic results involve species-specific bacteria. So 100% human strain is a key first question to ask. Then we get into looking at what's the clinical backing and finally CFU count. All right, so as we start to look at the clinical studies that back a particular probiotic formula, it's really important that we differentiate between a species, which is like Lactobacillus acidophilus, and the particular strains of Lactobacillus acidophilus that exist. So why does this matter, you may ask? Well, let's just think about, dog sledding. If you were to buy a ticket to go dog sledding and you showed up and there was 10 chihuahuas hooked up to the sled, you would be upset because you would recognize pretty quickly that you were not going very far, if moving at all. Now, if that owner of the operation came out to you and said, I'll give you 100 chihuahuas, you still would not be happy because you would know that there is likely no amount of chihuahuas in the world that are going to pull that sled. So when we look at, bacteria, it is incredibly the same. We can see Lactobacillus acidophilus. There are, that is the species that's akin to saying dog. There are tons of different strains of Lactobacillus acidophilus. And yes, while there may be lots of overlapping factors and characteristics, just as there are in all the different breeds of dogs, aka most dogs are all going to bark, be it to differing levels and differing sounds to their bark, but they all bark. They all have 4 legs. They're all born with ears, albeit some stand up, some are floppy. But, again, there is huge differences in size, differences in temperament that have major implications for functionality. Some make great guard dogs, some are great family dogs. Some are going to pull a sled, others you can put in your purse. Again, lots of overlapping characteristics, but mega differences for functionality. Bacteria are no different. So when we start to look at clinical studies, we have to appreciate this and ensure that we're looking at not just the species, but the species and strain. So here's an example of how this typically plays out. If we read here in this abstract, Lactobacillus plantarum col66 could alter the behavior of major cholesterol-absorbing cells of the intestine and reduce their ability to transport cholesterol. Awesome, that's super exciting and interesting. We cannot, however, go from here to extrapolate that, hey, Lactobacillus plantarum potentially has the ability to help lower cholesterol, right? Because that's just the species. Lactobacillus plantarum col66 might have the potential to help us lower cholesterol by potentially affecting the intestinal cells that can absorb it. So again, being responsible, not just in how we promote information and research, but then how we make our selection and making sure that we're not just referencing a species, but we're looking at the species strain that was used in the research and ensuring that we're using the same strain at the same dosage. So once we know a strain, has clinical backing and has been shown to be effective in achieving what we want it to do, the next thought we want to turn our mind to is dosage, right? And ideally, just exactly the same way that we're looking to, select strains that have been proven clinically, we want to then look at, what dosage were they given at in those clinical studies and try to mirror that dosage in our patient and clients. So now what happens if we don't have a clinical study? Say, for example, we're dealing with perhaps an individual whose hormones are out of balance, and that's maybe their chief concern. So we know that if there's an unbalanced microflora, that is really root cause and can be one of the things that, at its core can drive, imbalanced, hormonal symptoms. But perhaps we don't have a study, showing, what dose of probiotic is linked to, reducing a particular symptom of concern. So then we want to turn our mind back to, well, what part of the system, the digestive system, are we looking to affect change in? And for the vast majority of individuals, it's the duodenum, right? Because this is where the gut-brain interactivity comes, the endocrine interactivity comes, as well as, the immune, the crux of cytokine activity throughout the body, driven by microflora. A lot of this is concentrated in that duodenum. So we know the lactobacilli are the, dominant. So we're likely going to see, like, looking at the research of, lactobacilli species strains, and then, determining, like, okay, we know the concentration is not heavy. So this is where 10 to that kind of 20 billion is going to make a really significant impact. So personally, when prescribing out of the HMF line, I am looking at the 10 billion CFU products like the HMF Fortes, etc., as being really great daily maintenance. They're amazing for, kind of preventing the development of issues, but also, looking at, when there is course correction, when we see symptoms that we're trying to treat, we maybe want to take a step up to something like the HMF Intensive, that 25 billion range, or something else in that, kind of range where we can start to rein in the disorder a little bit more functionally. Looking at the large intestine, this is where we bring out the big guns. So this is where the 500, the HMF Intensive 500, this is what it's geared towards. And so, clinically speaking, I am reaching for that product when I'm seeing, issues that involve the large intestine, such as skin concerns like eczema or, psoriasis. These have been times clinically in a case study where I've reached for that. Similarly, for people with colitis or Crohn's, those have also been times that I personally am reaching for the Intensive 500, which is more bifidobacteria heavy, and using sometimes 2, 3, 4 sachets a day, when there's an acute need, and then tapering back down to a sachet or half a sachet as a maintenance dose. That's what I'm personally recommending and encouraging, in cases such as that. And that's where the physiological need is. So when's the appropriate time to incorporate prebiotics? Well, the answer lies in really understanding what's the difference with probiotics and prebiotics. So we talked a little bit about, prebiotics. The main focus is in helping to nurture the microbiome of the large intestine, the fermentation piece. But I often, hear people talk about, oh, I can't tolerate FOS. I have an issue with legumes, let's say, for example, in some of these high fibrous foods. So why is that? So people, who struggle with prebiotics or high fibrous foods, oftentimes it's because they have an unbalanced microflora. And I can't tell you how many times when I've talked to someone about probiotics, they said, "Oh, I tried that. It made my symptoms worse." And a lot of times, it wasn't explained to them that the quote unquote, truly, and it was, it's a real worsening of symptoms was due to the die off of undesirable species within their gut, right? So if we think about probiotics as the flowers, and prebiotics as a fertilizer, which is really well suited because our gut really is like a garden. You think about most gardens, if you leave them unattended, which is most people's guts, and if someone's never taken a probiotic, you can anticipate they have a really weed-filled garden. We would never fertilize a garden full of weeds. We would first weed that garden, dig up the weeds, plant the flowers, and then fertilize. It's a great strategy to treat prebiotics the same way. So I typically will always start with a probiotic that is completely free from any um, prebiotics, so no FOS, just the probiotics, just the bacterial organisms. Get that turnover. There can still be some die-off symptoms at the beginning. It's really important to explain to an individual that that brief worsening is really a sign of improvement and it shows that they need it. The HMF strains of bacteria are not gas producing, they produce lactic acid. So that bloating or gas production is by those undesirable gas producing bacteria that we're actually clearing out. And so as the HMF strains go in and displace them, there's kind of like an extra plume of gas. And that can result for some people, not just in the bloat, but also in a loosening of stools or even a constipation, depending on what kind of gas producing organisms they have. Methane producing organisms tend to produce more of a constipation, sluggish bowel picture, while the hydrogen producing organisms or disulfide, are going to be more of that, loose diarrhea stool. So regardless of what someone has, they can see a worsening on either end of the spectrum, and just always explain to them that that is something that they can alleviate by just slowing down, titrating the dose, taking a day off or two in between doses just as they ramp up. And then, again, once they have maybe, 1 month course, consider entering the prebiotics after that. Okay, now let's get into the really fun stuff of looking at the 4 core strains that make up the heart of the HMF line and what they have been shown in human clinical studies to do to improve our physiology. And I think what I get so excited about here is that I hear a lot of times people talk about like, oh my goodness, you've got so many products within the HMF line. Sometimes it's just overwhelming and I don't know where to go. And the great part about these 4 core strains that really are the bedrock of almost all of the formulas within the HMF line is that they have been studied by Dr. Nigel Plummer and his team and applied to so many different aspects of human physiology and shown to deliver so many different types of benefits. It's a really unique strategy. So, Nigel talks about all the time that they thought there was going to be really, specific strains and species that delivered really specific physiological benefits. And what they found was that was not necessarily the case because these 4 strains deliver a wide variety of benefits through all different types of organ systems. So we're going to start to hone in on, what are some of the most exciting research studies Nigel's team have done with this cluster of strains. So Dr. Nigel Plummer selected these 4 core strains because they demonstrated the ability to do 2 really important things incredibly well. First and foremost, they showed great natural tolerance to acidic conditions, which allows them to survive the exposure to stomach acid. So they, again, we know that bacteria needs to be able to survive the stomach, which, the stomach acid, in addition to starting to break down protein, is about helping to sterilize our food. So the ability to survive highly acidic conditions, hugely important. And these 4 strains check the box there. Number two, once they get to the small intestine, they demonstrate an incredible ability to attach to the epithelial lining. And again, when we think about value with probiotics, ability to attach is the most important thing for what is going to convey value to us. Because once that bacteria attaches, it then has the ability to form a colony. That's why we describe bacteria with CFUs. That's the unit we describe, colony forming units. And so, let's say if we're looking at the HMF forte 10 billion CFU, each of those 10 billion cells, once it gets into the small intestine and attaches to the epithelial lining, now has the ability to divide exponentially in creating its own colony. So that 10 billion CFU very, very quickly ramps up and exponentially increases, right? But if we take a different type of bacteria that is not as adept at surviving the stomach and not as adept at attaching, then it doesn't matter if we start off with 100 billion if we lose 90% of it, right? So you get to see where, more is not always better when it comes to CFU. There's other key elements we want to be looking for in our probiotic. Today, we're going to look at the benefits that these four core strains have been shown in the human clinical trials to deliver, with respect to when they're used alongside antibiotics, what they deliver with respect to immune benefits, digestive, and cognitive health. And these are by no means the only four areas that Dr. Plummer and his team have investigated. There are numerous other categories. As I mentioned, they're some of the most broadly studied strains in the world, but these are, four major areas that are really, really important as foundational elements to health. And we're going to see today, looking at the studies in these areas, what these four strains can deliver. Antibiotic resistance is truly a global health crisis and one that I don't think gets near enough attention. We in our lifetime will see a post-antibiotic era where we just don't have the antibiotics to leverage the way we still currently do. So the fact that we have anything in our arsenal to help not just slow this down, but really combat it and reduce the growth of antibiotic resistant bacteria is huge. And I think this is one of the things that gets me the most ramped up about the HMF probiotics and their ability to help reduce antimicrobial growth is just so, so powerful, because this, quite frankly, is something that affects all of us, any age, any country, it doesn't matter, preconditions not, if we encounter a bug that, a super bug that we can't fight off and we don't have a tool in the arsenal, this is just devastating. So buckle up as we talk about what the HMF strains can do on this front. So Dr. Nigel Plummer and his team teamed up with Cambridge, and they rolled out a few different clinical trials where they leveraged the HMF probiotic strains alongside antibiotic delivery. And so the first thing that we're going to cover is their shown benefit to help minimize the development of resistant organisms. So in this trial, double-blind, placebo-controlled, we saw the usage of 25 billion CFU a day. So that was the HMF intensive. And so let's take a look at what was achieved when that was given during the course of antibiotics. So the patients enrolled in this study were requiring a 3-week treatment with antibiotics. But prior to the administration, they did a baseline testing, and the type of bacteria they were looking at was enterobacteria. And so 18% of the people enrolled in the trial already had detectable levels of antibiotic-resistant enterobacteria. So they divided that cohort of individuals that were ID'd already having antibiotic-resistant bacteria within them between the two groups, and then they administered the 3-week course of antibiotics. So as you can see here, the group that did not have probiotics, at the end of the trial, 100%, every single individual in the control group developed some detectable level of antibiotic-resistant enterobacteria. This is not a nice form of bacteria. This is a kind of bacteria that we are highly concerned about if it, gets systemic, if it escapes the gut, can really, really cause trouble and actually, be fatal. So really problematic that, again, develop that antibiotic resistance. Now here in the HMF group, the baseline 18% of individuals that tested positive before the antibiotic trial, it increased to 30%. So even with the 25 billion, there was still an increase in bacteria developing antimicrobial resistance, but vastly reduced in comparison to the control group. So as we see that 25 billion, the HMF intensive formula, that's those key four core, when given alongside an antibiotic, dramatic reduction in the development of antimicrobial resistance. A second trial that was conducted with Cambridge utilizing the 25 billion CFU alongside antibiotics was looking at the prevention of opportunistic growth. So here they were looking at Enterobacter, enterococcal, and staphylococcal colonies, and there was 3 cohorts. There was a cohort that was given the 7-day course of antibiotics with placebo the whole time. There was a cohort that was given the 7-day course of antibiotics plus placebo for 7 days, followed by a 3-week period where they were given the HMF intensive, the 25 billion, and then a third cohort that was given the antibiotic for 7 days and the HMF intensive through the whole 28-day trial period. And so as you can see here, with cohort 1 that received the placebo the whole time, these opportunistic species of bacteria shot up and they never came back down to baseline levels. So they became elevated and then became the new dominant colonies, never to return back down in that 28-day period. So they rose and stayed high. Cohort 2, we saw the same elevation over the 7-day course of antibiotics when they were being given the placebo, but here at day 7, when they began on treatment with the HMF intensive, the 25 billion CFU, brought down those opportunistic species back down to baseline levels, showing the ability of the HMF strains to displace undesirable bacteria and recolonize with those optimal human strains. Now, here, cohort 3, when the HMF, the 25 billion CFU, was given alongside the antibiotic, albeit 2 to 3 hours apart, obviously, because we don't want to give it at the exact same time. We want to give some spacing. That prevented the surge in the increase of those opportunistic species. So we were able to maintain here that optimal flora and not see the surge of these problematic species, and which can be so common with antibiotic treatment. So the 2 studies I just spoke about used 25 billion CFU, and theoretically we could have leveraged the antibiotic care claim that Health Canada granted because of those studies on the HMF intensive, but however we chose to put it on the 100 billion CFU product, which is our HMF Replenish. So this 100 billion CFU contains 75 billion of those 4 core broadly studied Celtic strains, along with an additional 5th strain, this Salivarius Col 61. So the reason and the rationale behind that decision was because, as you remembered, in the first trial that looked at the increase of antimicrobial resistance, there was still that jump from 18 to 30%. So there was a cohort of people that still with the 25 billion CFU did develop some presence of antimicrobial activity in their guts. And so the thought process is that by increasing the CFU administered during a course of antibiotic, theoretically would hopefully bring and narrow that gap even further, so to provide more care. So while the vast majority of people at 25 billion CFU will not develop the antimicrobial resistant organisms, the thought process in putting a higher dosage is just to ideally convey that much more protection. Another great benefit of utilizing these 4 core HMF strains alongside antibiotics is their ability to help prevent antibiotic-associated diarrhea. And this goes as far as to prevent antibiotic-associated diarrhea driven by C. difficile. So C. difficile diarrhea is actually, a really, really problematic, hard to treat, potentially fatal condition that can be really, really resistant to treatment. So again, having something that can help in this regard is huge. And one of the things that evidence has shown is that, there's actually from a mechanism of action perspective that, evidence points to toxin neutralization as well to helping decrease the symptoms that we see typically develop in people with C. difficile. In addition to the four core strains of HMF that we're talking about, another organism to be thinking about is Saccharomyces boulardii. Saccharomyces boulardii has been shown to also be really effective at helping to decrease antibiotic-associated resistance. Saccharomyces B is a non-pathogenic form of yeast, so it's a much bigger organism. So if you've ever looked at a capsule that contains Saccharomyces B, you'll see it's actually it's visible to the eye. And, I like to describe it as kind of like a Pac-Man that kind of goes through and helps to, eradicate and chomp up other, problematic organisms. We often, think and hear about it in the prevention or treatment of travelers' diarrhea, but also can be hugely effective here in reducing the risk or helping to treat antibiotic-associated diarrhea. That being said, we do want to be mindful, although it is definitely not a pathogenic yeast, in individuals who may be immunocompromised, we might just want to take some extra care. And, Saccharomyces boulardii may not be the optimal choice. So again, in someone who is significantly immunocompromised, perhaps avoid to be extra cautious. Now, for me, the HMF Travel is one of my favorite HMF products because it combines the four core strains that we've been talking about with 5 billion CFU of Saccharomyces boulardii. I know, when it's in practice and sometimes standing in front of the fridge thinking like, oh, do I give them the Saccharomyces B or do I give them, the four core strains? Prior to the release of this product. And now as practitioners, we do not have to choose. We can give one probiotic that is going to deliver, both the human strain colonizing benefits as well as that kind of extra antimicrobial punch of the Saccharomyces B. So the HMF Travel, while its name, does speak and is a nod to its benefits with respect to traveler's diarrhea, is a very multi-purpose probiotic in my mind. Definitely something that we could be thinking about to recommend alongside the antibiotic course, although because it is 12.5 billion of those four core strains and 5 billion of the Saccharomyces B, we would want to give 2 a day to get up to that dosing that was in those 3 Cambridge trials to ensure that we're, matching the clinical evidence to hopefully prevent the opportunistic growth as well as the preventing the antimicrobial resistance and again the antibiotic associated diarrhea. Let's turn to looking at how we support digestive health on another front with something that it just seems to be increasingly common with IBS as a chief complaint. So here we're going to look at the Sheffield IBS trial, and this was a clinical trial done with Dr. Plummer and his team, again, looking at that 25 billion CFU count. So the 4 core strains that we're talking about, HMF intensive, being delivered daily dose for 8 weeks. And let's take a look at what the participants of this study experienced with respect to decreases in GI discomfort as well as increased satisfaction of bowel habits and quality of life. So here we can see that as regarding days with intestinal discomfort, participants experience a 22% decrease over the course of those 8 weeks. And I think this is really significant because as practitioners, we know IBS is a multifaceted issue. There's often dietary changes, stress management elements, again, multifaceted ways that we want to approach this with our patients and clients. So to be able to administer, a once a day dose of anything, and have a 22% decrease in, intestinal discomfort, that's essentially in a Monday to Friday work week one day without pain, which is huge from a quality of life perspective. And again, without having to make any lifestyle changes yet. So you think about as you make those dietary lifestyle changes, it just compounds. So in addition to that 22% decrease in days with intestinal discomfort, there was also a 32% improvement in satisfaction with bowel habits. And that's really huge because as we know, IBS can be really detrimental to someone's quality of life. And so having, an improved satisfaction with, urgency and, the ability to, have less bowel movements and just overall satisfaction with consistency, this makes a big difference in someone's world. And again, for something that is a chronic condition, just once a day dosing, these in my mind are really impressive numbers. So due to the results we just looked at in the last slide, Health Canada issued the ability to have the label claim for IBS relief. And so as you'll see, the HMF intensive, the 25 billion, this is what was utilized in the clinical trial. And so when we look at our HMF IBS relief, it is exactly the same formula, same breakdown in amounts of each of the 4 core strains that we see in the intensive. So these two are for all intensive exactly the same. And we look at with IBS, there are often food sensitivities, other things, and we can really be confident as practitioners in recommending this because it is dairy free. There's no FOS, so really important we talk about getting someone's gut under control, kind of weeding it out. So not worried about that as an aggravating factor to the gate. Vegan appropriate, no GMOs, not containing gluten. It's gluten-free and soy-free. So really, minimizing the exposure to some of those common food sensitivities and delivering a prebiotic-free formula that is a great choice out of the gates for anybody with IBS. So moving into the realm of immune health. So the ProChild study was a study that was done and looked at children kind of preschool age, and they were supplemented with 12.5 billion CFU of these 4 core strains and a smidge of vitamin C in there, 50 milligrams, but really not anywhere near enough to be therapeutically significant with respect to immune health that is there. And the context of this study was really looking at improvement in upper respiratory tract health. And what they saw was Dr. Plummer's team witnessed a 51% reduction in total number of days with upper respiratory symptoms. So half as few days sneezing, sore throats, coughing, runny, stuffed, blocked nose. 33% reduction in the frequency. So 30% less often they were getting sick, and when they got sick, they were sick for half the time versus the control group. Also, as well, a 30% reduction in days absent from school. So this is a huge, kind of quality of life factor for parents. Like having children who are sick, is a massive, not just obviously miserable experience for the children, but can be really difficult, especially for working parents. And so this study here, these results were actually reproduced when Dr. Nigel Plummer and his team ran this ProChild study a second time and demonstrated a second time similar numbers and the ability to repeat, the results. So the HMF product that corresponds to the ProChild study that we were just looking at is our HMF Fit for School. So the HMF Fit for School, as you can see, combines the 12.5 billion CFU of those 4 core strains that we've been talking about today with that smidge of vitamin C that was in the trial, but has the added benefit of 1,000 IU of vitamin D. So we can expect all of the data, numbers, the 51% decrease in days with the symptoms, a 33% reduced frequency, 30% reduction of absenteeism. We can expect all that and more because as we know, vitamin D has its own immune health benefits. So we're really getting a synergistic formula here. The other piece that I love is that it is a chewable form. So that's obviously great from a convenience perspective, especially for children who are not going to be, capable of swallowing capsules. And, it's great for parents to just pop out of the pack and not have to worry about mixing a powder. But the clinical aspect that I love about a chewable is it naturally spends more time in the mouth. And so what it does is it gives an opportunity for the bacteria to coat, in not just around like oral health, which we know is huge, but just colonize the oral nasal pharyngeal cavity because we're talking about the benefits that we see from the gut immune function in the duodenum. But one of the ways that our bacteria help protect us from an immune perspective is when they attach on the attachment sites of our epithelial, they make it harder for pathogenic bacteria to attach. So as we know, a lot of times exposure comes, from airborne particles, the respiratory element. And so having a chewable form, I think especially is effective when we're looking to promote immune health. So getting that kind of micro armor of bacteria and having it flush out and colonize those attachment sites in the oral nasal cavity is huge. Making this for me definitely one of my go-tos, regardless of actually whether it's child or adult, if we're looking to maintain optimal health. Never take a look at the Keel study and the ability of these four core strains to help improve aspects of cognitive health. So, in this study, there was a group of people who experience trait anxiety. And trait anxiety manifests in kind of a constant up and down, disproportionate predisposition to worrying and nervousness, often um, regardless of the external circumstances. So it's not necessarily the experience of nervousness and stress is not necessarily proportionate or ebbing and flowing with external circumstances. It's really kind of like a constant up and down, and hence that term trait anxiety. These would be like your nervous Nellies, so to speak. So these individuals, again, a placebo double-blind controlled study, were given 25 billion CFU of those four core strains that we've been talking about for the course of 6 weeks. And in comparison to the group that got the placebo, those that got the probiotic strains reported a significant decrease in their feelings of worry and nervousness, as well as an increased ability to focus and being less prone to distraction. So positive on two fronts, with that emotional component being relieved, but also increased like mental ability, to stay on task and avoid distraction, which we can see that so often. A lot of times, I've heard and spoken to patients that are concerned about issues with memory, but when we dig in, we look and there's a lot of stress and worry. And so when we're stressed, that's occupying a lot of our kind of mental capacity if we're worried about something. And, we can end up operating a little bit mindlessly and be really prone to distraction. So this is a beautiful study that encompasses all that. And what I love, and this brings it right back to the beginning where, I talk about why I personally believe that probiotics are so foundational. It's because when an individual is reporting, more chief concerns in the mental psychological realm, it can be easy to reach for some of our, nervines, whether that's in the form of homeopathics, nutrients, or botanicals that really hone in on the central nervous system. But I'm often encouraging, individuals and practitioners alike to think about, the gut, because so much of our neurotransmitters, the production and balance of our neurotransmitters that keep our central nervous system operating, effectively, really rely on the microflora in our gut. So in order for the proper production of serotonin, dopamine, even melatonin, we need a healthy microflora. And this is a great clinical study that shows how that kind of plays out in real time for individuals. And again, over the course of 6 weeks. So things that are chronic with one dose of, the right, species and strains of microflora, really yielding significant quality of life results over a relatively short period of time for looking at a chronic condition. So that 25 billion that we were referring to in the Keel study is the exact same compilation that was used in the other studies that we're talking about, the four core strains, and this exact compilation to get us to the 25 billion. So again, that is the HMF intensive, which is the exact same as the HMF IBS relief, same product, just double faced in different ways. And a great thought to kind of be thinking about is when we look at the overlap for individuals who have IBS, there is a significant increase within that population of mental health concerns, particularly this propensity towards nervousness, worry, et cetera, and mood related issues. So this is a great product to be thinking about both on the front of IBS as well as mood regulation. So we talked a fair amount today about the travel and the health benefits associated with this unique combination of the four core HMF strains along with the Saccharomyces boulardii. But one of the things that makes the travel so great is the fact it's shelf stable. So it just has that added level of convenience. In other formulas within the HMF line that you're likely already aware of and familiar with the fact that they are also shelf stable are our HMF Fitness, the HMF Intensive 50, which is our delayed release option for those unique times when you want to target the kind of deeper regions of the intestine and you want to kind of miss that beginning region. And my personal favorite, the Candiclear 4, which is a phenomenal herbal probiotic combination that as practitioners can really help us, look at kind of resetting the gut. I typically look for this as my weed and seed protocol. So it has a combination of garlic, caprylic acid, cinnamon, alongside a strong probiotic, and as well is shelf stable. So it comes in a unique kind of strip of 4 different capsules that can be taken daily, and just really helps to kind of up the ante with dislodging the undesirable microbes in the gut and recolonizing with those 4 core strains that we've talked so much about today. So what's exciting, and you might not be aware of, is that our shelf-stable offerings are expanding, including some of our best sellers and some of our kind of most popular daily options for maintenance, as well as really important condition-specific formulas. So the IBS relief that we talked a lot about today, and the HMF Immune that we will speak to in part 2. So again, just to reemphasize, the refrigerated versions of these products, they are good out of the fridge for up to 20 days at 25 degrees max. These new shelf-stable formulas, like the ones we saw on the page before, they can be out of the fridge in room temperature up to 25 degrees for their entire, lifespan, never see a fridge, and at their date of expiry, they're still guaranteed to deliver the label claim of what's the CFU count that is cited there on the label. So really exciting and great options for practitioners who perhaps don't have the fridge space and can carry these in order to offer to their patients and clients. Other new news for new formulas within the HMF line are the HMF Vaginal Health suppositories, which are phenomenal because we talk a lot about obviously the gut microflora, but we know that cultivating healthy vaginal flora is also hugely important. And while taking an oral probiotic supplement will help foster good vaginal health due to the migration, it is sometimes indicated that we really want to give a direct source of bacteria in cases that we see we're trying to correct a more acute issue. So we have the HMF vaginal suppositories, which deliver 100 million CFUs per suppository and are also shelf stable, along with new HMF baby liquid drops, also shelf stable, so easy to throw in a diaper bag and have with you on the go, and really exciting claim of helping to provide relief from colic symptoms, which I think anyone who has had a colicky baby or been around a colicky baby knows just how powerful that can be. So 1 billion CFU per 5 drops, and we'll talk about these both a little bit more extensively in part 2 as well. But again, new exciting delivery mechanisms also in shelf-stable formats. Okay, so what are the key points you want to take away from today? First and foremost, obviously, there are so many benefits to having a fiber-rich diet and a lot of benefits in particular to our GI system. And, fiber is important prebiotic to nourish the bacteria, especially the large intestine. But if we're looking to optimize the health of our microbiome in the small intestine, we absolutely need to be supplementing it and nourishing it with live organisms. So when we look at choosing, which live organisms that we want in a probiotic formula, what are the 3 criteria? First and foremost, human strain. The HMF strains have been shown to stay in the system for up to 8 weeks compared to your average dairy-based strain that comes from cows, which is going to be a week to 2 at max. So again, that's why it's number 1 in securing an effective probiotic, human-sourced bacteria strains. Then strains, not species, but strains that are backed by clinical research. Finally, number 3, now we can look at CFU count and remembering that if we're looking to target the small intestine, we kind of are in that 10 to 20 billion range versus the large intestine. Then we go to the big numbers like 500 plus CFUs. Last but not least, what are the key instructions we want to make sure every patient or client walks away really having hammered in their head? Ideally, always take with food. We know that the HMF strains are naturally acid resistance. They're going to survive the stomach acid no matter what, but when we give them with food, we get the extra benefit of the transit through the small intestine being paused and giving the bacteria a chance as the food empties into the small intestine. It has about 60 to 90 minutes where it can sit and bathe in those enzymes and breaking down, absorbing, and it allows the bacteria the best chance to attach in the upper region, the duodenum, to the epithelial lining, which again is where we said the vast majority of the gut brain, gut immune, gut hormonal, really system-wide effects are taking place. So always suggest with food. If we're giving alongside an antibiotic, which hopefully we are all excited to do moving forward because of all those benefits that the clinical trials demonstrated, ensure that the individual knows they need to take it 2 to 3 hours away from the antibiotic. Last but not least, hopefully we hammer into our patient client's head that any kind of aggravation of symptoms, when starting a probiotic shows that it is working and we want them to continue taking it. They can pause for a day or so, let those symptoms subside. They can half the dose, they can titrate up a little bit slower, but ensure that they know if they feel worse, it is because they have a suboptimal, imbalanced, undesirable microflora. And so we really need to clean that up. And the aggravation is because of the turnover and die-off. It's not an adverse reaction to the actual probiotic itself. Okay, those are the key takeaways I hope you guys keep with you moving forward. These next couple slides are just summary slides of some of the trials that we spoke about. So as you can see here, the Cambridge clinical trials, those were the trials where the HMF strains were given alongside antibiotics and showed the decreased overgrowth of potentially opportunistic harmful bacteria, minimized loss and kind of preservation of our good bacteria, that lactobacillus that we find in the small intestine, which is typically the most disrupted by antibiotics, as well as significant reduction of antibiotic-resistant organisms and decreased incidence of C. difficile associated diarrhea, mainly also neutralization of the toxins, which is really key for helping prevent the damage to the GI system. Moving on to the Sheffield IBS trial, that's where we saw the reduction in both intestinal discomfort as well as improvement in satisfaction with bowel habits. and then the Keel study, which is again those four core strains. All of these at the 25 billion CFU dosing. In the Keel study, we're seeing that decrease in the feelings of worry and nervousness and the increased ability to focus and avoid distraction. On this slide, we have the ProChild study, which we did cover today, looking at the immune benefits of the four core strains, namely that 51% basically halving the time of duration of upper respiratory tract symptoms, 33% reduction of the upper respiratory tract infections developing, as well as 30% decrease in absenteeism from school, which all parents love to see. And again, this was with the nursery school children age. But again, while this is a ProChild and done in children, the 12.5 billion CFU of those four core strains, I often will, recommend this to adults. It's a great, kind of daily dosing to just prime up our immune system and again, that preventative approach. Here is a bit of a teaser with the Promogen metabolic study in the Swansea baby trial. So these are studies that we're going to talk about in part two. The Promogen is, there's a bit of a teaser when we talked about the difference between strains and species, and we looked at that abstract. And we talked about that unique Lactobacillus plantarum. So the Promogen study looks at our new HMF metabolic and the combination of our four core strains that we talked so much about today with the addition of that Lactobacillus plantarum Col66 strain, and looking at some really interesting, remarkable studies in reduction of weight, waist circumference, as well as decreased incidence of upper respiratory tract infections and some other improvements in general mood, energy, as well as other systemic elements, which I think is really powerful in that it speaks to, the wide-ranging benefits to our physiology, numerous organ systems that these four core strains have been shown to develop and deliver in the human trials. The Swansea baby trial, this is exciting. This is a little bit of a deviation. We have two of the four core strains in here, but we have two different ones, and we'll speak to that in a little bit more detail. But really, really powerful results that show when given in the early months of life, predominantly the first 6 months, we have a unique opportunity to really change the trajectory of that individual's health, namely through the development of their immune system. And so here, there was a 44% decrease in allergen to common, typical like milk, eggs, pollen sensitivity, the allergy development, and 57 decrease percent in expression of atopic eczema. And so we'll do a bit of a deeper dive into that element, but those are some of the exciting things to come in part two. So we hope you join us. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you are all feeling so much more confident, in choosing probiotics now that you know the key criteria that are of most importance when making your selection. I do also hope that you join us for part two, where we are going to take a look at the line of HMF and kind of do a deeper dive into some of the specialty products we have and some of the unique combinations where we kind of have a 2-in-1 formula where we couple and leverage the broad physiological power of these four strains we've talked so much about today with either other unique strains that have shown, a kind of unique ability to make a positive shift within the physiology, or other kind of key nutrients that support the action and system that we're trying to most affect change, whether it's, nutrients or also even botanicals, which is a unique thing to be able to do that Dr. Palmer's team have been able to couple, botanicals with these probiotics and not compromise the viability of the bacteria. We are also going to do a bit of a deeper dive into understanding shelf stable and what makes the difference there. So we hope you join us for that.